Conference online. My name is Lara Keenan. I am the Governance and Management Consultant here at the Vermont Department of Libraries. Welcome to the session Library Advocacy in 2020, Making the Case for Support During Uncertain Times with Vermont Library Association President Kevin Unrath. Kevin earned his master's degree in library science in 2000, and since then he has worked in both public and academic librarianship around the United States over the past 2 decades. He currently serves as the director of the Pearson Library in Shelburne and is the 2021 president of the VLA Association. Kevin has successfully advocated for funding throughout his career, including leading local and statewide efforts. Thank you for joining us, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Laura, for the kind introduction, and thanks everybody for taking the time out today to join me. I love this topic and I love libraries. So my name's Kevin Unrath. I'm the director here at the Pearson Library in Shelburne. As Laura mentioned, I've been a librarian for 20 years. It's my only career, and I love being a librarian because I love to get to see people come in the library and learn whatever it is they want to learn about. And I get to do that almost every day. As Laura mentioned, I'm also the president of the Vermont Library Association. So the VLA, if you don't know, is an educational organization, and we work to develop, promote, and improve library and information services and librarianship in the state of Vermont. So we hold an annual conference. We offer lots of continuing education, just like the Department of Libraries does with this wonderful conference they're hosting. We advocate for libraries and librarians on a local and a state level. We represent your interests in regional and national library organizations like the New England Library Association and the American Library Association. And if you don't know, there's a Friends and a Trustees section of the VLA. And if you're not a member, I would strongly encourage you to consider joining. Just go to www.vermontlibraries.org to learn more. So today we're talking about advocacy in 2020 during uncertain times, during these times with COVID. And I have a few learning objectives to begin. After each slide, I'll pause if there are any questions that come up, but I'm also happy to take questions at the end of the presentation as well. So today we're going to look broadly at advocacy, and I'm going to give you one definition of advocacy and then look at the basics of how to accomplish that advocacy. We'll look at some strategies for advocating during this COVID pandemic. And it's certainly not as straightforward as it used to be, but it is very possible. And I also want to talk a little bit about the need for advocacy during times of economic downturn, which we may be facing soon. So during the Great Recession from 2007 to 2010, libraries actually saw a 25% increase in the use of their services. So people were coming into my library to apply for jobs, to apply for social services, just to come in to have a low-cost option for education or entertainment. There were all sorts of reasons why libraries were more important during those difficult economic times. But also nationally, we saw that funding for libraries either stayed flat or went down during the Great Recession. And so should we be experiencing something similar in the next few years, it's important that we all learn how to advocate so that we can make sure that we're not left out of the picture when it comes to library services. So with that being said, it's not all doom and gloom. I've made sure to put in a few sources of inspiration for us to think about when we think about advocacy. So this is an architect's rendering of the new library, town hall, and senior center that is currently being built in South Burlington as part of their city center project. This is a $22 million building, and the project received more than 70% yes votes when it was voted on in 2018, and South Burlington did a pretty extensive public information and awareness campaign leading up to that vote. So there are some great stories. I'll have a few more later on, but I don't want it all to be kind of doom and gloom. So I'll include a few of these as we go along. And I also wanted to tell you in big, bold letters that you are already a great advocate for libraries. Trustees, friends, volunteers, library staff are the best advocates for their library. Just think about it. You know more about the library than the average person does. You've been a part of the inner workings of the organization. You're coming to this presentation to learn more about advocacy. You go to meetings, to book sales, to programs at your library, and that speaks to your commitment and your knowledge of the library. Your friends, your family, your coworkers probably look at you as the library person when they have a library question, and they look to you for guidance on what's happening with the library. And also, as a friend or a trustee or a volunteer, you have the ability to speak in a way that municipal or state employees might not. So as a municipal employee, I'm not allowed to actively advocate for a position while I'm on the clock. It's considered a conflict of interest. I'm actually taking off this hour to give this talk. When I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico about 10 years ago as a library manager, when we were going through the Great Recession, our leadership asked that we try to recruit a few folks at each of our branches, and there were 17 branches throughout that city, to help share our story about library funding. And they told us specifically to identify those patrons in our head, then clock out and ask them if they'd go talk outside about library advocacy, outside of the building. I felt like that was a little shaky, but I did it anyway. And we did end up passing the bonds we needed to pass. But as a trustee or a friend, you are very uniquely and well positioned to advocate for libraries at any level. So in short, you're a great advocate. So as I mentioned in the learning objectives, I'd like to present a definition of advocacy for us to consider as we go through this presentation. There's lots of different definitions out there. I thought it would be good for us to have one that we're all thinking about together. For this session, advocacy is broadly defined as the actions that either individuals or organizations undertake to influence decision-making at the local, regional, state, or national level. And those actions then help create a desired policy or funding change in support of libraries. Now, this definition is taken directly from the Public Library Association's Turning the Page curriculum. And I would highly recommend, if you have not looked at this curriculum before and you're interested in advocacy, go to the website, publiclibraryadvocacy.org, and take a look. It's an entire course on how to advocate effectively. I know that Laura and I have both taken this training, and it's very straightforward. It's very results oriented, and it's certainly worthwhile taking a look at. I'm pulling a good amount of what I'm talking about today from the Turning the Page curriculum. So here's another element of inspiration from previous career. This is the email newsletter that I still receive from the Albuquerque Bernalillo County Library System. They have a somewhat unique form of funding for their materials. In New Mexico, there's a once every 2 years general obligation bond issued statewide that voters vote on to fund currently about $10 million in materials funding for school, tribal, public, and academic libraries. And that's been a bond issue since 1968. So for more than 50 years, they've had general obligation bonds issued via vote through the state to fund materials. And then in the largest city in New Mexico, Albuquerque, they have both city bonds that are issued to support that, and then in Bernalillo County, county bonds every other year So there are three different sets of bonds that are voted upon by voters in Albuquerque that relate to library funding regularly. And so the City of Albuquerque Libraries established a foundation that advocates actively for the passage of these bonds as well as support of the library budget. The bonds have never failed. They've even passed during years when other bond issues have failed. In 2008, I was the head of the state advocacy committee. It was actually a political action committee that led the statewide effort. And that year, the library bonds passed despite the Great Recession. But there was another bond that was out for financing building projects at universities, and that one actually failed. So it was kind of bittersweet. But this is an effort that I take inspiration from, and it's entirely run by volunteers and staff off hours, both the Political Action Committee and the Library Foundation. So I think I calculated about $20 million of materials have been purchased via these bonds since their inception. So why advocate? Well, $20 million of materials, that's one reason. But looking at it a little larger, we advocate in libraries because we want to be able to provide high quality services to our community. So we want them to have the resources that they need. And there are really three different sort of subcategories for the advocacy you might be doing. One is just to build support in general and build lists of people who you can go to when there's an issue that comes up. So building that general support. Second, you can advocate for a specific opportunity, a specific thing that will support the community. For example, a building project would be a goal-driven advocacy campaign. And then third would be preventative advocacy. This is if there's some kind of a threat to the quality of the services offered at the library or library funding in general, like when there's an economic downturn. Oftentimes, municipalities and other funding sources look at libraries as low-hanging fruit, unfortunately, and we advocate to try to let decision makers know that, in fact, we're very important during times of economic difficulty. This advocacy can take place at many different levels, certainly at your local level, sometimes also at the state level or even regionally or nationally. The last three budgets proposed by our federal administration have all included defunding the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is the main federal funding supplied to libraries. It funds about somewhere in the range of 25 to 35% of the Vermont Department of Libraries budget. And thankfully, those proposals were all nixed through a national advocacy campaign. And we were able to maintain funding for the IMLS. But that's the sort of national advocacy that would have a real impact here in Vermont if it wasn't done. So, so advocacy takes place at all different levels. And advocacy is most effective when there is a specific goal that is identified. This also comes from the Turning the Page advocacy curriculum from the Public Library Association. So you hit what you aim at, and if you aim at nothing, you will hit it every time. It's good to pick a goal. So for example, with the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the goal was to restore funding to the level at which it had been in the previous year. But there are really four steps to picking a goal. And I'm going to talk now at the local community level, and I'll give you an example of this process. So the first step is to look at your community and identify an unmet need. And then hopefully that's a need that the library in some way can meet. So if you need a wastewater treatment plant, probably not the library, but there are lots of needs that the library can fill. Then try to identify what the barriers are within the library for filling that need. and then what the solutions are that can help you overcome those barriers. So find an unmet need, figure out what the barriers are, identify the solutions, and then where advocacy comes in is which one or ones of those solutions can you achieve if you involve decision makers. And so here, I'll give you a quick example. Let's say that your community need is access to technology. So we all want members of the community to have access to the internet and the benefits and opportunities that that offers. Your library currently offers free public computers and internet access, but the computers are a little outdated, the internet access is slow, it's no longer fully meeting the needs of your community. Why is this happening? Well, there could be a number of reasons. One, perhaps your library doesn't have a maintenance plan in place for computers. Maybe it hasn't established what a replacement cycle is like and what a minimum level of connectivity might be for you to successfully serve your customers. Another reason might be that there hasn't been funding allocated for updates to computers or for high-speed internet. So those are a couple of reasons why that community need might not be met. So solutions to overcoming those barriers, one would be to establish a technology maintenance plan and an update cycle and establish what the level of internet service and speed that you need are. Another solution would be to have an increase in your library's annual budget so that you would be able to buy more computers and to buy faster internet. And so obviously, the solution that requires advocacy is not the internal planning solution of having a computer replacement cycle, having established what you need. It's having local government increase your funding so that you can provide fully those computing services that you want to provide. So that's a 10,000-foot overview of how you might go about establishing a goal for an advocacy campaign. But it is important to have the goal. You don't just want to say, we want people to notice the library. Patrick Sweeney from Every Library, which is our national library advocacy lobby, essentially, talks about in his trainings the difference between people who like the library and people who will vote for the library. And almost everyone, both in 2008 and 2018, when this question was asked in a study, said that they like the library. But it's a decreasing number of people that have said that they would actually vote for something that the library was asking for over time. So the goal of advocacy isn't to try to get people to recognize or like your organization. The goal is to get them to vote for improving your organization, and it's an important distinction. Laura, I'm just going to pause and see if there are any questions at this point. I'm happy to move forward if there aren't, but I can't see the chat, so.
Yeah, we don't have any questions yet in the chat, but if folks have it, please feel free to enter your questions in the chat.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to show you a somewhat intimidating chart. This is also from Patrick Sweeney at Every Library. This is his library advocacy and engagement chart, and I don't want you to worry about writing down any of these elements, let alone every single one. I just wanted to show you how sophisticated a large-scale advocacy and awareness campaign can look like. I am going to talk about the 3 phases that Patrick identifies and break them down, but I don't want you to worry about this chart as a whole. It's a little bit beyond me, to be honest. But it does break down advocacy into 3 different phases, and those are surfacing, supporter ID, and the action phase. I've included a link there, by the way, to everylibrary.org. They are a wonderful organization. They provide a lot of training. They also provide support to campaigns that libraries are engaging in. Some of that support is through their resources, and some of it is actually through consulting, and it's typically pro bono. They don't they'll do the work for free if that's what you need. So they're a great resource to take advantage of. Surfacing. Surfacing is when you're beginning to think about that goal that you identified and bringing that to the attention of potential advocates. This is getting together a small group of like-minded people who you know about the library, know about what you're doing, people who are on your board of trustees, friends group, trying to gauge their interest in moving forward with this activity. So that surfacing aspect of advocacy is when you're starting to bring that idea to the forefront. You might put out a survey, you might do some public outreach on a small scale to try to refine the concept. But it's basically when you're just bringing about whatever it is that you're looking at. Then supporter ID, which is actually the largest phase of an advocacy campaign, is taking that small kernel of an idea and that small group of people and getting a lot more people interested in supporting it. So taking whatever the goal is, and if you've revised it based on when you've talked to folks and checked in with stakeholders, and building the visibility and the communication of that goal moving forward. And then finally, the last stage is the action part of things. That's when you're actually doing something visibly to try to make a change. You could be trying to get an item on for a ballot initiative. You could be asking people to vote. You could be asking people to campaign to raise your funds, but that's the active part of things. Let me just back up to that previous slide, and I want to show you how much time is taken for each one of these. If you look at Patrick's flow chart of advocacy, the surfacing and the supporter ID portions take up 11 of the 14 steps. So the great majority of that advocacy is getting out there and talking to a small number of people and then a larger number of people and getting them on board with your idea before you go out and actually try to make change. So I'll give you an example that Laura and I are very familiar with for this sort of advocacy, and that's the new library that we both advocated for here in Shelburne. We spent the better part of a decade on surfacing and refining the goal of building a library here in Shelburne. We never had a library. Our original library was a post office, then it was in a rectory that had been remodeled. Then it was moved across the street to what was the clerk's, and none of those buildings were really adequate for what we needed. But it took dozens of trustees, it took 2 different architects, it took a few different library directors to work through the process of what a new library might look like. Finally, between Laura's tenure and mine, the community came together and coalesced around what a new library should look like and came up with a price tag. And the new library was put to a bond vote, and we had, after more than a decade of work, to put all of that advocacy into action. And so trustees used their networks that they had created to get the word out about the project benefits and the costs, and we had more than 3 dozen public events in 4 months to get the word out. And then Friends worked on a campaign of yard signs, of letter writing, and of personal meetings to encourage the positive consideration of the project, as well as showing up at select board meetings to talk about it. And in the end, our bond vote passed, and we were able to build our new library and raise $1 million to help support it in about a year. So that's a little bit about the front loading of advocacy to building support and your networks of support. All right, I want to talk about one more story of inspiration. I just love this, these advocates in Philadelphia. I'm going to quote a little bit from this article written in mid-2019 about a couple of advocates for the Philadelphia free library system. When Philadelphia threatened to close 11 neighborhood libraries in response to 2008 budget cuts, Betty Beaufort was there, feet on the ground, pushing back against the closures. The looming threat swiftly drew hundreds of residents who united to advocate for the 54-branch system. By early 2009, the threat of closure was gone, advocates had prevailed, and Beaufort was named president of Friends of Queen Memorial Library in Point Breeze, where she's pictured here. I can't sit there and know when something is going on and just do nothing, she says. On Monday, fast forward to 2019, she and a dozen or so advocates attended a budget hearing before City Council, waving signs that read "not enough" and "no excuses." Council members also asked about the system's crumbling facilities and staff shortages. The library's current budget is nearly $49 million, with about $40,000 of that coming from the city and additional support through state funds and private donations. But it used to be $55 million, and during the Great Recession, it dropped down to $33 million, and Betty and her fellow advocates have spent more than a decade now trying to restore the funding to the levels that it used to be at. This is a great example of someone who's inspiring, who has worked as an advocate, who saw the need and decided she would work on communicating that need. The other person mentioned in the article is Erika Zurer, who lived around the corner from another branch and instantly recognized how important the presence of that branch was to her community. She said she'd see it was closed and she'd see a line of people waiting to go in. She saw when she would go in, there was water dripping from the ceiling. Why was her library closed? Why was it in crumbling condition? And so she reached out to her friends group, and then she ended up working on advocacy and going to these meetings and trying to get the word out. These same advocates now are working to try to keep funding for the Philadelphia Free Library in times of COVID, when they're once again working on trying to reduce their funding levels. So a couple of examples of wonderful library advocates that I hope are inspiring.
Kevin, we have someone raising their hand. Beth,
Yes.
Go ahead. Unmute yourself, Beth, if you'd like to ask a question. I think you can go ahead, Kevin. Maybe Beth will speak up later.
Okay, yeah, feel free to stop me again, Laura. I'm happy to answer any questions. And I can back up on the slideshow too. So I'd like to talk now about different avenues that you can use for advocacy, especially during these times when you can't really go and have coffee with someone easily. But there are a lot of avenues that you can use now to advocate for whatever your goal is. So media is a wonderful option. Social media, Facebook, Instagram. Front Porch Forum is our #1 social media platform here in Shelburne. That's what everybody reads who's using social media more than anything. You can also take out paid advertisements through the media, and then some of you may be familiar with the idea of earned media. That's when you work with a reporter to try to have a story done about whatever the issue is that you're working on. One of the best connections you can make in your community is to know either a television or a newspaper reporter who would be interested in telling your story. So that's earned media. Personal advocacy means using your connections that you have to further your message. So that's talking to your neighbors, that's emailing people who share your passion. Phone calls are a wonderful way to connect. Patrick Sweeney was talking about this at a conference last week. He said that 30% of the advocacy that political campaigns do is still phone calls. So despite what people see as sort of the takeover of advocacy in social media and messaging, 30% of all of that advocacy for political campaigns happens via phone call. And I think people are much more interested in talking over the phone now since they can't get out and socialize as much. At least I found that to be the case. People that maybe wouldn't be as interested in a phone call now might be. Texting is also an option, as well as emailing. Public events, obviously not as easy to do in the time of COVID. You can still host a virtual networking event. You'd have to do a good amount of advertising, or you'd have to have someone who the folks would really want to talk to, because I think we're all doing a lot of virtual events now. So you want to make it relevant and interesting. One of the best ideas I picked up from the Library Advocacy Conference through Every Library was actually from a lobbyist for universal healthcare. Her name was Kristen Murphy, and she suggested that we ask our local legislators to host a story time where they pick out books that they feel are important to them and read those virtually to kids. And that does a couple of things. It gives them publicity and gives them the opportunity to interact with their youngest constituents, but it also builds a relationship between you and your local legislature, your legislator. So you would get to know them, you would be helping them talk to folks in their community, and then later on, if there was some sort of ask that you had, you would already have that entree to speak with them. You would already have their email, they'd know who you were, which is really at the core of relationship building and advocacy. So that's just one idea of a public event. And then finally, mail. Direct mail is something that's really challenging for libraries. It's hard to identify who library supporters are. It doesn't necessarily, according to research that's been done, fall along the lines of people who either are library card holders or who are more liberal or more conservative. There's no one group that you could buy a mailing list and know that you would be reaching the right people. For example, some of the strongest library supporters might not ever come in your library. They just might feel that libraries are an important institution for your community. So direct mail can be a bit challenging. It can also be expensive to mail things out, but email lists are wonderful for low cost, high value advocacy. And establishing an email list is a great way to build a community of supporters. So we use MailChimp in Shelburne, and we have a list of almost 1,000 people that we mail on a monthly basis out of 7,500 residents. And we've built that list through people who come in and get a library card. We've built it through our online presence. We built it through our campaign when we built the library, through our donors, and also just through word of mouth recruitment from our trustees, our friends, our staff. So building an email list is a great way. By the way, if you have less than 1,000 folks, MailChimp is free to use. So I would highly recommend that. Laura, were you able to get that question, or should I keep going?
Kevin, this is Joy. We're hearing some echo when we ask questions. We're wondering if maybe we might be on speaker on your end. But as for the hand that was raised, that was a mistake. So.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Can you hear me okay otherwise?
We hear you great. It's just when Laura speaks, and just now when I was speaking, it was echoing as well.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
That's
I will
okay.
do my best after to open up the chat and try to answer questions that way. So.
Okay.
I'm almost at the end of the presentation part anyway. So I wanted to just offer a few kind of tips and tricks that I've found important over my couple of decades working in libraries and working on advocacy. My first is that you should have, for whatever your goal is, a plain English, short explanation, a few sentences of what you want and why it's important. This is a trick for thinking through issues, to be able to state something succinctly and in plain English. If you can't do that, you may need to refine your goal a little bit more. but it's also something that you can use whenever someone asks you what's going on, when you have the opportunity to advocate and you didn't expect it. It's a good thing to know. Here's a little secret. Remember when I was introducing myself and I said, I'll quote it here, I love libraries because I get to see people learning the ways they like to learn every day. That is absolutely true, but that's a line I've come up with over many years to explain specifically why libraries mean something to me. And so I would encourage you all at a minimum to think about what libraries mean to you and to come up with kind of a personal manifesto along those lines. It's very useful to have your own kind of house in order and to come up with that sort of a speech. Second, when you're explaining your goal and talking about your goal, make sure that you're not just talking about how wonderful it would be, but try to get folks to do something when you're advocating. So you want them to take action. If you're making a sign, if you're posting on Facebook, if you're presenting at a select board meeting, if you're working with a reporter on an article, make sure you include some action that people can take. So sign up for our email list, donate to our fund, volunteer to help get out the vote. Do you remember also that I mentioned that there was a Friends and Trustees section of the Vermont Library Association? I'm trying to get you to sign up, which, by the way, you can do at www.vermontlibraries.org if you would like. So make sure you're asking people to do something every time that you advocate. Don't just give them information. Third, make sure to consider your audience, who you're speaking with. This is something I picked up from everylibrary.org. So when you're providing messaging, make sure that if you're trying to talk with a certain segment of the population, you're crafting your message to reach those folks. For example, now this is not library related, but let's say you're trying to get more people to wear masks in your community. You could say, wearing a cloth face covering can reduce the spread of COVID-19 in communities by up to 80% when coupled with social distancing and frequent hand washing. That's one way to say that message. Another way is, the most patriotic thing you can do right now for our country is to wear a mask, stay 6 feet apart, and wash your hands. They're both trying to accomplish the same goal, but I hope you can hear that they might be intended for different audiences. So consider who you're talking to, what the group is, or what segment of the population you're talking to with your messages. A couple more tips. This is a hard one for me because I love to talk, but it's very, very important to listen as you go out to advocate. You're going to have your elevator speech. You're going to have your goal. You know the reasons why it's important to you, but you're not going to be able to convince someone of its importance, which is ultimately the goal of advocacy, to bring people over to your side and get them to talk about it, unless you're also willing to listen to what they bring to the table. So someone may have a very good point that revises your thought about your goal. You have to actually be open to change yourself if you're going to try to change someone else's mind. So make sure that you're listening just as much as you are talking about what's meaningful to you. And finally, one more tip. The International Federation of Library Associations has a wonderful series of 50 blog posts that take 10 minutes to read, along with exercises on advocacy. I've included the link here for that blog post, but I'd highly recommend it. They're really great. They're kind of funny. They're easy to digest. And if you do one each day, then by December 1st, you will all be experts in library advocacy. So that is my final tip. And I will end by saying thank you. Thanks so much for taking the time out to learn about this topic. I would be more than happy if you have any questions to answer them. This is my email address, and please do send them my way. I'd also like to thank Laura and thank Joy for being here from the State Library and for organizing this. And now I would be happy to take any questions that you have.
So Kevin, this is Laura. Behind the scenes, we've figured out if you mute yourselves when other people are talking, we won't hear the echo. And you just have to unmute yourself to talk. But yeah, the muting helps get rid of that feedback. So thank you very much, Kevin. We have a bunch of people in the meeting with us, and I would like to invite any one of you to either type a question in the chat and we can read that out loud for Kevin, and for the folks on the phone to be able to hear it, or you can feel free to, you can raise your hand using the toolbar, I can call on you, or you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, and then make sure you mute yourself again and Kevin will answer it. And if you're on the phone, you can feel free to hit *6 and that should unmute you. And it looks like we've got a question in the chat. People wondering about the blog link that that you just showed, Kevin. I'm hoping that maybe we can steal your slides from you and post those on our website so people can click on that link.
Absolutely. I will make sure that I get you those slides, and if I can figure out how to get the chat up, I will copy that link into the chat as well.
Great. And if that doesn't work, Kevin, like I said, we will post Kevin's slides on our website on the main conference page. We'll replace the link to this meeting and replace it with a recording of this meeting and his slides, so folks can download those and share them with the rest of your boards. Looks like we have one question in the chat. What is your best advocacy victory, Kevin, and why do you think it was successful? Make sure you unmute yourself.
Thank you, and Gary, nice to hear from you. I really enjoyed your presentation on HR, by the way. I would say I would share, I think the library that I'm currently in right now, and I would share that victory with a ton of other people, Lara included, who laid a lot of the groundwork and did a lot of the surfacing to make this project happen. But in order to get this building built, it took a tremendous amount of work over a short period of time. And I would say, I also, thinking about that, I would add that we had a couple members of our community who were recruited to be on our board of trustees who did the bulk of the advocacy for that project. And that's a point that I hadn't thought of before, but I would say, if you can get community leaders who are passionate about your library to get out there and talk for you and be a part of your advocacy team, that may be the most important thing for being successful. But I would say that the building project here in Shelburne was the most meaningful for me because it was so necessary.
Thanks for that, Kevin. I think you're right. It absolutely was a group effort. We would not have been able to do it with a large team helping us out with that. Almi, it looks like you've got your hand raised. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Okay, hi, I put it in the chat too, but this is fine. First, I want to preface this by saying I'm not saying this is the situation I'm in right now, but it's a general question that I thought might be helpful is, do you have any suggestions for encouraging trustees who might be reluctant or skittish about doing public advocacy?
That's a wonderful question, Almi. It makes me think about something I learned when I was working at a university library back in the early 2000s. We all did Myers-Briggs tests, and everyone on our staff, except for one person, were introverted. I think most of us were INTJs. We were not the sort of people that would like to go out and talk with folks, I would say, necessarily. But so part of what I found interesting in libraries is that folks sometimes are not interested in doing that sort of political work that requires a lot of sort of meeting strangers, getting out and talking, being very social. And I would say if that's the case, if that's the reluctance, then finding activities that don't require sort of cold calling or a lot of face-to-face socializing. So working on the back end of things, working on sort of mailing or things that are more using social media or using written conversation are useful things. So that's part of the answer there. The other part I would say is that if you have library board members who just genuinely aren't interested, it's not that they're a little fearful, but it's that they're genuinely not interested in advocating for the library. I would talk with whoever my board members were who were my champions and try to get them to sort of ask some probing questions and try to figure out, is this person just really not interested in this part of what we do, or are they burnt out on the library as a whole? But I would try to pull in another library board member who I know is a champion to talk with them. So does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for that question, Almi. Looks like we have another question. Someone was asking if you'd be willing to talk about the size of your friends group at your library and its major activities.
So our friends group has really only about 8 to 10 very active members. We have a membership of about 100, give or take, friends who make contributions. But in terms of active members, we only have about 8. And their marquee, their raison d'etre, the thing they do, like at a lot of libraries, is a book sale. So to raise money for the library. But it's having them work on advocacy was not much of a stretch once we talked to them about it for the building project that came up, because they were in the library every day or every week. That core group of 8 folks, they were here regularly. They saw the need. They loved the library, which is why they were a friend. So they were perfectly willing to try to make that case for us. It just required a couple of meetings outside of work time to go through the nuts and bolts of why the friends are the best group to advocate for this, and why they can say vote yes on our library bond proposal, whereas the trustees are only able to say please vote on this, and to explain kind of the differences there between being able to provide the public with an awareness of the cost as well as the benefit of a project versus a friends group that are able to do a small amount, I believe it's 10% of their time and or their budget, of actual political advocacy to say vote yes. So once we educated that group for our bond vote, they were totally on board because they already, whether they knew it or not, were wonderful advocates for the library. So.
Thanks for that, Kevin. We have a follow-up question to that, which is, are you familiar with any libraries that have undertaken fundraising since the pandemic, and anything about their experience? Do you have any knowledge of that?
I don't. I haven't looked at any libraries that have started a campaign after the pandemic. I would be interested in seeing that myself. I know that there are lots of libraries looking at how they can try to make sure that their budgets are looked at in a reasonable fashion. And there's a lot of, I talk with directors all over who are looking at what they're expecting in terms of cuts this year and how they're going to try to talk with their towns about that basic idea that libraries get busier during difficult economic times, and so we don't. We need to make sure that any funding that's cut is cut kind of even with other departments or other groups. But I don't know of any library that's actually started a capital campaign right now. I would be curious to see if I was in that position, to be honest. I think I'd be talking a lot with the town and with my trustees and my friends about whether we might need to pause because it would be a really challenging time to do that.
This is Laura. If folks look at my fundraising training slides that I put on the main conference page, I do talk a little bit about fundraising during the pandemic. I have some resources for you. And then tomorrow afternoon, the Trustees and Friends section of VLA will be releasing a handout with some fundraising ideas, and we'll be putting that on our website. We've been working with the Trustees and Friends section of VLA to plan this conference. So we have a couple other questions. We have a few minutes left. Kathy is wondering, she loves the idea of the 30-second elevator speech and wondering if you could repeat yours for folks.
I'm going to assume this is the one for our building project. And let me see if I can get it back in my head. Shelburne has never had a purpose-built library in its 120-year history. We've been housed in the post office, in the rectory, in the old police department, and we've spent the last 10 years looking at what a library might look like for residents if we were to build it as a library. And I'm excited to talk with you about what that might look like and what the benefits are of our space. That wasn't the best. I think I did a better job a couple of years ago, but that was the general pitch.
Excellent. Thank you very much. One last question that's in the chat, and feel free to add some more because we have a little bit of time. What about everyday advocacy as opposed to big goals? Any ideas for trustees for everyday advocacy tips?
Yeah, I would say it's always a good idea to try to be talking with leaders in your community and building your network. So I didn't talk a lot about that aspect of advocacy, but making sure that you're regularly reaching out to folks in other town departments, to leaders in the community, say members of the Rotary Club here, members of your business community. One of my goals this year as the library director is to talk with the directors of the Shelburne Museum, Shelburne Farms, and our local craft school and talk with them about how we might all work together to try to present the sort of the nonprofit cultural aspect of Shelburne in a unified way and support each other. And that sort of networking that you do that may not come under the rubric of a specific goal really pays dividends when you do have a goal that comes up. So I would say making sure that at least once a month, if not once a week, you're meeting with someone new, or you're talking with someone who you haven't talked with in a while and checking in with them and seeing what they're doing and letting them know what you're doing. That's really important kind of maintenance work to keeping that network going and building it.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. I think that was a fantastic way to bring us around to a close. I don't have any other questions, but if you have any last minute tidbits you'd like to leave us with before we close.
Well, I'll say one last thing on that note. First of all, thank you all so much for attending. I'm super excited about this topic and getting the word out. I got a tip that on any sign or any post or any bit of communication that you make sure that you get that call to action of having people sign up for something. So make sure that you put sign up for our email list, or on all of your posts or all of your communications. Make sure people have the next step they can take. That's what I'm most excited about right now. But I'm really excited to see all of you here and to get to talk about this topic. So thanks so much.
Great. And a big thanks to Kevin and the Vermont Library Association for partnering with us on this conference. Thank you all for joining us here today. And I hope folks will join us tomorrow as well. And goodbye. Thank you.